The T-34 is a divisive vehicle among tank enthusiasts. It is one of the most widely used tanks in history and much praise has been sung of it over the years. Yet it is also a vehicle that had many troubled moments in its history of service, being the single most knocked out tank in World War II and having many technical drawbacks that prevented it from having the tactical advantage on the battlefield, all whilst facing various issues with its production that impacted its quality, often with fatal results. Additionally, the T-34 is one of those vehicles that has evolved beyond being a simple vehicle, but instead is also a symbol. The T-34 is a staple of Soviet-era propaganda, becoming a symbol of victory and triumph of the Soviet people against the invader. Official narratives presented by the USSR portray the vehicle as a masterfully engineered manifestation of the will of the Soviet people in its struggle against the invader in the Great Patriotic War. But on the other hand, the monuments of Soviet victory installed upon Warsaw Pact countries, to many are remembered as looming symbols of oppression placed vigil over a subjugated populace by their occupiers. In the late 90s and early 2000s, pop history ran with the image of the vehicle as being a masterfully designed marvel of engineering, whilst overlooking many of its flaws. Considering both these factors, it is no mystery why many still feel a frustration towards the vehicle. This often results in many attempts at discrediting the propaganda and misconceptions portraying the T-34 as a miracle weapon, overextending and creating myths of their own, resulting in the T-34 being a controversial and hotly debated subject, to the point that most of the discourse you see nowadays is more between people who say the T-34 was irredeemable garbage versus people who say that the T-34 was a good enough tank for the strategic circumstances that the USSR found them in. Not with people who think the T-34 was particularly amazing. One of the popular talking points discussed in regards to the T-34 that acts as a center point for many of these debates is the often bestowed moniker of the tank being revolutionary. Nowadays, making such a claim will likely result in quite a bit of aggressive pushback. Is the vehicle that is the most knocked out tank in World War II, a tank that was frequently bested by vehicles and weapons that on paper should have been inferior to it, and not being a pioneer in any of its traits that it's often praised for, such as sloping armor, really a revolutionary vehicle? Or is this just the work of Soviet propaganda? However, the T-34's actual battlefield performance has little impact on whether it can be classified as revolutionary, nor does the vehicle need to have been strictly the first to incorporate a certain feature to be deserving of the title. Let's look at the definition of the term revolution. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a forcible overthrow of the government or social order in favor of a new system, or a dramatic and wide-reaching change in conditions, attitudes, or operation. Therefore, there is a case for the T-34 being revolutionary because it represents a transitioning stage of Soviet tank doctrine from the pre-war to the early Cold War period. Rather than just making mild improvements on the BT series, as was initially intended, after a series of shifting requirements, design changes, and realizations, landed on what was, at the time to the Soviets, essentially a new class of tank, what nowadays we would call the typical World War II era medium tank in popular vernacular. If we simply look at the immediate technical qualities, it is a vehicle armed with a dual-purpose gun that has the capacity to provide more reliable protection against most contemporary AT guns, is mobile enough for both operational exploitation maneuvers and tactically able to cope with a wider variety of terrain, whilst also raising the weight expectation to the 30-ish ton bracket. These are features that heralded the principles of future Soviet medium tanks, and separates them to the tanks that came before. From our current perspective, this may seem like an obvious development, but keep in mind, at the start of the war, this wasn't as much of a set-in-stone concept. Even the Germans still had their separation of duties between the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs with their short-barrel 75mm gun. To put this in perspective, this is what the catalog of Red Army tank classifications looked like in the mid-1930s. Essentially, the T-34 allowed for a vehicle that could make 3 of these vehicle classes, if you would, obsolete. The traits the T-34 could offer, even though often this was only at a theoretical level, provided something that could serve as a new core of the Soviet armored force. If we look at the kinds of tanks and the respective roles that came to be fielded by the Red Army in the final years of World War II, we see the template that naturally evolves into the post-war Soviet tank organization until the advent of the MBT and the decline of heavy tanks. Even if its combat record was as abysmal and irredeemable as many like to pitch it as, and even though it had its various technical shortcomings at its introduction that prevented it from being the game-changing force as its statistics on paper may suggest, on a conceptual level at least, the change was apparent. Taking this into account, it really didn't need to be the first to present features like sloped armor or a diesel engine to be considered revolutionary, but rather what it did with those features. Not many people will contest the statement that the Centurion was an undoubtedly revolutionary tank, but as far as aspects of the vehicle that made it arguably the first main battle tank, it wasn't the first in the world to incorporate the features that allowed it to be a contender for that vaunted title, but rather how its features were incorporated and the change it brought in British tank design that made it so revolutionary. Going back to the definition presented at the start of the video, whilst the first definition is clearly primarily a political literal one, if we were to interpret it metaphorically, the T-34 did herald an ousting of an older system and the creation of a new in Soviet tank philosophy. This change in attitude and practice was dramatic and wide-reaching. It is dramatic as it essentially made the structure of Soviet tank classification set in the 1930s obsolete and will influence the future thinking of the largest tank-producing country. And the ripple effects of Soviet tank doctrine, both during the war and early Cold War itself, which was set in motion with the incorporation of the T-34, would have ripple effects on how it influenced the trajectory of the development of the armies who had to counter such doctrine. Now, of course, there is a degree of subjectivity involved, and you could very much argue that unless a tank was as enterprising and had as much of a global, long-lasting impact that everyone had to copy it like the Renault FT did, it doesn't qualify for the title of revolutionary. Thus, neither the Centurion nor the T-34 are deserving of such label. And whilst I must politely disagree, I must acknowledge the consistency in the rhetoric. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to let me know what you think about this discussion in the comments, leave a like if you've enjoyed, and be sure to check out the other videos on my channel and subscribe if what I do here interests you. Thank you again, and I hope to see you all again soon.